Hi again. In the last chapter of Armageddon Now by Dwight Wilson, the chapter is Jerusalem, What Now? We're on page 209. The continued drive toward European unity has served to fertilize premillenarian speculation on the revived Roman Empire, which under the Antichrist would ultimately resist Russia or play some other great role at the end. At the beginning of the decade of the 1960s, the King's Business magazine, still fascinated by the role of the United Nations, spoke of a pattern that was emerging on the international scene that could easily be the setting for the advent of the Antichrist. In 1963, John F. Walvoord, in the Sunday School Times, wrote of Europe's economic revival as a prerequisite to political revival and of the possibility of a 10-nation unification. This pattern foreshadowed for him the fulfillment of end-time prophecies. Richard DeHaan emphasized the significance of the formation of the common market as the revived Roman Empire. Lindsey in 1970 said he believed the common market to be the revived Roman Empire, and that predictions of a United States of Europe by the year 1980 might need to be foreshortened in view of rapid developments. He asked, "Is it any wonder that men who have studied prophecy for many years believe that the basic beginning of the unification of Europe has begun?" In spite of setbacks to European unity in the years following, Moody Monthly, in a 1974 article, Prophecy and the Common Market, was still optimistic about the probable revival of the Roman Empire. Where the United States was to fit into all these rapidly approaching events continued to be of interest to some writers. Is the United States in prophecy? Was extensively discussed in the King's Business by the president of Detroit Bible College, Roy L. Aldrich. After commenting on various scholars' identification of Tarshish in Ezekiel 38:13 as Great Britain, Aldrich concluded, quote, "The idea that Great Britain is to be identified as Tarshish and that the United States is one of the young lions is only a theory, and one which is contradicted by most of the evidence. It would seem to be the part of wisdom, not to attempt to identify any modern nation as Tarshish, at least not until more definite detail and definite evidence is available." He believed that the identification of Tarshish as Spain was more in keeping with what little evidence there was. A few years later, Frank M. Boyd in the Evangel identified Tarshish as Tartessus in southern Spain near Gibraltar and reconciled the two views. In either case, we know who has possessed Gibraltar for many years. This is a direct quote from that article. And we are acquainted with the lion symbol of our passage as referring to Britain, the British lion. The late great planet Earth was very definite in its predictions. The United States was to decline in power until it became only an adjunct of the European power and would succumb to the leadership of the Antichrist fighting against China in the great battle of Armageddon. Implicit in Al Lindsey's chronology was the conclusion that the United States will have nothing to fear from the Soviet Union at that time. Russia was to be destroyed by God at the very beginning of the Armageddon struggle, whereas the United States would be around later to participate in the Armageddon main event. 1973 was the 25th anniversary of Israel's independence, and many magazines offered commemorative pieces which characterized the premillenarian response to Israel, as well as to Russia occasionally. The Evangel magazine began the memorial year by editorializing the old determinism. As a race, they are unique because they have a divinely determined destiny. The Evangel magazine said that directly. The quote goes on, "God chose them for a purpose, and that purpose must be fulfilled. Until then, the nation may be despised, and it may even be decimated, but it cannot be destroyed." End of quote. Moody Monthly explained that evangelicals identified with the Israelis because of the Jews' initiative, the common Old Testament roots, sympathy for the persecuted, and their prophetic significance. This self-analysis closely parallels that of Nadav Safran, cited earlier. United Evangelical Action, the publication of the National Association of Evangelicals, took the occasion to castigate the liberals, and particularly the World Council of Churches, for their unfriendly attitude toward Israel, citing Rabbi Marc Tannenbaum's censure of the liberal Protestant community for failing to support their Jewish neighbors on nearly every priority Jewish concern except for the problem of Soviet Jewry. The author, Arnold T. Olson, summarized his indictment by saying, "The Arabs, the community of nations, and the church are all guilty of making Israel's survival during these 25 years more difficult, yet there is the miracle of survival." Christian Life proclaimed that the occupation of Jerusalem and the temple site as a result of the miracle of the 1967 war was a sign that the Gentile domination over Israel would rapidly come to an end. On the other hand, there were expressions of doubt about the moral position of the Israelis after 25 years. Eternity endorsed the incredible historical record of Israel's revival and the weight of biblical prophecy, but gave a two-part warning to our fellow premillennial believers. The first was that excessive dogmatism on prophetic details should be avoided. Quote, "History is littered with the torn-up pages of prophetic scholars who have linked Antichrists, wars, and other biblical elements with specific historical events." End of quote. The author was clearly concerned with the ever-expanding history of the premillennialist credibility problem. The second warning was to avoid glorifying the state of Israel. In the midst of the Watergate scandal, the invidious comparison was drawn. Quote, "Politically, Israel is no purer than Washington." End of quote. The author pointedly observed that Israel's leaders were not inherently inspired and that they needed occasional rebuke and rebuff, just like all political chieftains. Christianity Today similarly editorialized that although Americans might admire the determination and decisiveness of Israeli foreign policy, they should recognize that an inflexible pro-Israel stand might not always correspond with justice. The editor also pointed out that Arab control of all oil production meant that an inflexible pro-Israel stand might not always correspond with the American national interest either. Such realistic assessments evoked criticism from the Jews at the time of the oil embargo by Arabs after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Jews assumed that the only explanation for opposition to the Israeli position was a caving in to the Arab blackmail. It never occurred to them that there might be a sincere resistance to Israel's stubbornness in retaining Jerusalem and other conquered lands. Among the premillenarian press, however, there was never any questioning of the right of Israel to exist as a nation in Palestine. I'll put in a link to J.C. Ryle, way back in the 1840s, is talking about the Gentile times and what that would mean at the other end of the Gentile times, in a way that if only Russell and his followers had listened to Ryle and not to Russell, we would have had a much different religion created from Russellism and Rutherfordism. J.C. Ryle on the Gentile times on your screen.